Hi, this is Ms. Cooper with a tutorial on how to make letters that have diagonal lines in them. Now, I will not demonstrate every letter of the alphabet, but I will demonstrate a few. In fact, I'll demonstrate M, X, V, and N. These are fairly common letters that are requested. So I start by doing a grid with squares on a separate piece of paper. This helps me to understand what the letter would look like if it was flat. So then when I move on to the isometric paper, I understand how to make it three-dimensional. Now I'm starting with the letter M. So first I'm going to put a little bounding box to determine exactly how tall and how wide I want my letter M to be. It's wide, so I left some extra space to make sure I'd have enough to work with on my wide letter. So now with the purple marker, I'm going in and marking some dots that I need to connect to make the letter M happen. Now M does have tall sides, that's the easy part. We also know that it has little bits that stick out on the bottom on those little side arms. But I also know I need a middle part, especially since I did a little drawing off to the side to help me remember how to structure it. Now this is the time when you'll go off the grid, is actually when you draw those diagonals in there. So when you draw on your isometric paper, it is one of the few times that you will not actually follow the isometric grid perfectly. Now I chose to make my M dip kind of low in the middle, so the bottom part was kind of short and it's a little bottom heavy, but you can always adjust yours because once you have it on that grid, it's easy to translate to the paper. So now I'm taking that dark green marker and marking out where I had that overall bounding box for my letter, so I understand how it's going to fit on the page. Next, I'm going to switch over to my light green marker so I understand how this grid works. Now doing it with marker is not necessary, but for the purposes of demonstrating, it is pretty useful. Now I'm going to follow where I had purple markings in my grid, so I know that if the top was one box across, I go in one box. Same with the bottom, I follow that pattern of one box, stop, one box, stop, one box, stop. The diagonals are where it gets tricky, so I counted down to make sure I went down enough spaces and then marked where it fell in that grid. Then I simply connected the dots, so although I went off the grid, it still makes sense and makes the M 3D in a way that still works in the isometric drawing setting. So now I have the overall box of the M and I need to figure out how to push it into space. So I'm drawing my isometric snowflake and realizing that the way to go backwards is to do that right to left, bottom to top kind of motion. When I complete any part that's along the diagonal, I just make sure that it's parallel and then I know that it's correct. Now to make sure it's easier to see for the demonstration, I colored it in with markers here, but of course when you do your own artwork, you can do whatever you want with that. But now you can see how I use that bounding box and the grid to make this letter happen and to make it make sense. So now I'm going to move on to another letter so you can see this process again. Now I'm drawing a bounding box, but this time I'm taking it a different size just to show you what that might look like, and because this letter is not nearly as wide as the letter M. Right now I'm doing the letter X and I'm doing it with corners that indent into neat little points, which might not be how you draw your letter X, but it's nice to demonstrate with different shapes. So again, I'm figuring out where I want the center to be, and I'm connecting the dots along those diagonals and being very careful about how I mark my grid. Because I like the way it sits in the space, I know that I can move on to my isometric grid paper. I'll scoot it aside so I have some room here. So now I'm going to go back in with my dark green marker and make a bounding box. This time I'm going to make it go a different direction than the letter M. Maybe I'll have the front face left this time, just for something different. So now I'm going to mark out those corners. That's the easy part, but now I have to make sure I'm counting in my grid and connecting the dots to the proper parts of my grid. I sped up this video, but I actually went quite slowly and really took my time, especially since I knew I was working with markers. Using my isometric snowflake, I know that I need to go up and to the right with my connecting lines, and I carefully follow the diagonal of the X to make sure the whole thing makes sense. So this way my X is actually facing left instead, just to give you a different perspective on what your letters could look like. So my next step is to demonstrate the letter V. This is actually one of the easiest ones in the video, but I'm rotating it a different direction just for some added challenge and to show you another fresh perspective. I'm starting in again with my bounding box. This time it's 4 boxes wide and it's 5 boxes tall. It's very easy to mark the centers and the edges, except that it's 4 across. So I have to go halfway through 2 of them, but I still make it 1 box width so that it all looks consistent and even. This means that I have to be very careful and mark that point halfway through and be careful about where I put my dots that I'm connecting when I draw the final shape. So now I'm going to go 4 across and 5 deep, but this time I'm making the V kind of go on, let's say, for example, the top side of a cube. I'm rotating my grid paper so I can follow along more easily, and I'm being careful about how I mark halfway through. There we go. I marked it halfway through some of the boxes very carefully and very slowly because, again, this clip is sped up from how I actually drew. Now I drew a bit of a wiggly line on the lower side of the V, but if you were doing this, I'm sure you would take more time and you would use a ruler. Now when I'm running into the bottom, what I have to do is I have to make sure it goes 2 down, so I kind of look at a nearby point so I can estimate how far that is. With isometric drawing, you don't have to do any measuring with a ruler, but sometimes it does help if you count very carefully because it's all really in the counting. Again, a wiggly line, I'm sure you would use a ruler. You would probably take more time on your final project. I'm shading in the V just to help you out here. I decided to make this one a little deeper. I made it 2 boxes tall, just to make it interesting. At this point, I have 1 more letter left to demonstrate, so I took out my handy-dandy homemade grid paper again, and I'm drawing out my bounding box. This time it's the letter N, which is a very, very common letter and much requested. The most commonly used letters in the alphabet, at least in English, are R, S, T, L, N, and E. But right now I only have videos that show E, S, and N. But hopefully some of the other ones like L and T are a little easier. With the N, I drew 1 to the side to make sure that I was doing everything correctly because sometimes it's easy to get a little wrapped up in your artwork and accidentally not put something in the right place. At this point, I'm using my green marker to again draw out that bounding box. It is useful to draw, but drawing it in pencil certainly gives a better look unless you're just sketching or you're just kind of practicing. So now I have my dots and I connected them on diagonals and I use my isometric snowflake to push my N backwards into space. If you have any questions, please comment them below. I'd be happy to answer. And if you have any requests or suggestions for future videos, I would love to hear those and make one as soon as possible. Thank you so much for watching.